In 2025, the Senate Finance Committee uncovered a scale of financial activity around Jeffrey Epstein that went far beyond earlier estimates. Investigators documented over 4,700 wire transfers, totaling more than $1.1 billion, passing through a single account at Deutsche Bank, often without timely intervention from compliance teams. Even after Epstein's death, banks like Bank of America flagged suspicious payments only retroactively, raising questions about how such large sums moved through the system with so little scrutiny. Alongside these wire transfers, Treasury analysts traced at least $120 million in transactions routed through privacy-focused cryptocurrencies, such as Monero, between 2014 and 2019. These findings exposed major gaps in anti-money laundering controls and showed how regulatory loopholes allowed networks like Epstein's to operate with impunity. The paper and digital trails left behind now offer a rare window into how financial innovation and oversight failures combined to shield criminal activity for years. The dark web payment prototype. The Senate Finance Committee's 2025 investigation brought to light a little-understood aspect of Epstein's financial operations: the early use of privacy-focused cryptocurrencies to mask illicit payments. Forensic reports established that, as early as 2014, Epstein's network adopted privacy coins including Monero, Zcash, and Dash, moving at least $120 million through these channels between 2014 and 2019. This approach allowed his organization to exploit the anonymity these coins offered, making it nearly impossible for traditional financial monitoring systems to follow the money or identify the beneficiaries. Senate staff found that the network's crypto activity was not random or opportunistic. Transaction records revealed deliberate patterns. Funds were routed through shell companies registered in secrecy jurisdictions, with the largest flows occurring during periods when major banks and fintech platforms were investing heavily in blockchain technology. These privacy coin transfers, totaling $43 million between 2015 and 2017 alone, closely mirrored methods used by Russian oligarchs to move dark money out of sanctioned regions. Treasury analysts noted that Epstein's entities consistently avoided exchanges with robust KYC protocols, instead relying on offshore crypto gateways in places like the British Virgin Islands and Seychelles, where regulatory oversight was minimal. The challenge for investigators was the sophistication of these payment methods. Forensic accountants used advanced blockchain analysis to link clusters of wallet addresses, matching transaction timing with known Epstein travel itineraries, and correlating payment amounts to invoices for construction and flight charters. This work uncovered at least 17 previously unknown shell companies in Panama and Cyprus, which processed payroll and logistics expenses for Epstein's island operations using privacy coins. These findings demonstrated how the network was able to move large sums without triggering alarms in the banking system. At the time, blockchain monitoring tools were not equipped to detect or analyze privacy coin transactions. According to Senate testimony from Chainalysis executives, nearly 80% of Epstein-linked crypto payments went undetected by early oversight systems. Even as cybersecurity experts warned Treasury officials of these gaps in 2016, little changed. Regulators lacked both the technology and the mandate to keep pace with the evolving methods of financial concealment. It wasn't until late 2018 that meaningful improvements in blockchain analytics began to close these loopholes, by which point much of the money had already moved. As regulatory scrutiny increased after the 2017 congressional hearings on crypto money laundering, Epstein's network adapted. Transactions began to shift toward mixer services and privacy-preserving smart contracts, with $19 million moved through Ethereum-based anonymity tools in 2018 alone. These innovations allowed the network to continue operating, even as law enforcement started to focus more attention on conventional crypto exchanges. The constant evolution of these techniques made it difficult for regulators to catch up. The Senate investigation also found that the Epstein network's methods bore a striking resemblance to contemporary Russian dark finance operations. Transaction patterns and obfuscation tactics, such as coordinated microtransactions and the use of elliptical curve cryptography, matched those used by sanctioned Russian banks. While the extent of technical collaboration remains under review, the similarities suggest a broader trend of knowledge sharing among international criminal networks. Throughout this period, the vulnerabilities in early blockchain oversight provided Epstein's network with a significant advantage. For years, financial institutions and regulators failed to recognize or respond to the risks posed by privacy coins and related technologies. The Senate's findings make clear that these blind spots were not isolated to cryptocurrency. They were part of a broader pattern in which financial institutions, whether through limited tools or delayed action, enabled the continued flow of illicit funds. The persistence of these failures set the stage for a much larger problem, one that extended well beyond the world of cryptocurrency. Banking's willful blindness. Despite mounting evidence of suspicious activity, major banks consistently failed to act on clear warning signs in Epstein's accounts. Senate Finance Committee investigators found that Deutsche Bank processed $1.1 billion across 4,725 wire transfers for Epstein between 2013 and 2018. Compliance teams flagged a significant majority of these transfers for unusual characteristics, such as large round dollar amounts, rapid cross-border movement, and payments to individuals who had no apparent business relationship with Epstein. Yet these alerts rarely resulted in meaningful intervention. At Bank of America, internal records show Epstein's accounts moved $763 million through their Palm Beach private banking center from 2015 to 2019. During this time, staff filed 42 internal suspicious activity reports, but executives repeatedly decided to keep Epstein as a client. One 2017 email from the bank's chief risk officer pushed back against recommendations to close the accounts, citing Epstein's value in generating millions in annual fees and referring lucrative new clients. This pattern of prioritizing profit over compliance was not unique to one institution. J.P. Morgan Chase's handling of Epstein-related transactions underscores the same systemic failures. From 2010 to 2015, the bank filed only 3 suspicious activity reports on $486 million in wire transfers, even though federal guidelines indicated that at least 27 reports would have been appropriate for that level of activity. Treasury Department investigators later determined that 63% of all Epstein-related suspicious activity reports from major banks were filed late, sometimes months after the transactions occurred. In a 2024 forensic audit, Deutsche Bank was found to have backdated 14 suspicious activity reports following Epstein's arrest, apparently to obscure delays in reporting. Regulatory loopholes further enabled these failures. The 2024 Anti-Money Laundering Act increased reporting requirements, but kept the $3,000 threshold for currency transaction reports. Epstein's team systematically exploited this rule, making 941 transfers of exactly $2,900 from 2015 to 2018 to avoid triggering mandatory reporting. Senate proposals in 2025 call for lowering this threshold to $1,000 and requiring automated alerts for suspicious transaction patterns. But for years, these gaps allowed questionable payments to move undetected. Internal communications reveal that senior executives frequently overrode compliance safeguards. In 2016, Deutsche Bank's head of private wealth management approved $700,000 in cash withdrawals for Epstein without required documentation, and later authorized $12 million in transfers to Epstein's Virgin Islands companies despite missing beneficiary information. These exceptions were rationalized as necessary accommodations for a high-net-worth client, even as compliance officers expressed concern. Financial incentives played a decisive role. Deutsche Bank earned an estimated $28 million in fees from Epstein-related business, while eventual penalties totaled $150 million. The bank's leadership structured settlements to shield executives from personal liability, and the Senate investigation identified 17 senior bankers who received promotions or bonuses during periods when they approved questionable transactions. The analysis of penalties versus profits raises questions about whether current enforcement measures are sufficient to deter similar conduct. Epstein's team also took advantage of ambiguities in the so-called travel rule, which requires banks to share transfer details for payments over $3,000. By splitting larger sums into smaller, sub-threshold payments, they moved $79 million between 2014 and 2017 without triggering additional scrutiny. Relationship managers at several banks actively advised Epstein's associates to keep wire transfers under reporting thresholds, as documented in internal emails. The failures were not confined to Epstein's accounts alone. The same banks that facilitated his transactions also processed high-risk flows for other clients under investigation for financial crimes. Between 2015 and 2020, Deutsche Bank approved nearly 9 out of 10 exception requests for politically exposed persons, far exceeding industry norms. Recent reforms now require banks to document justifications for compliance overrides and impose clawback provisions on executive compensation tied to suspicious accounts. These breakdowns in oversight were not isolated missteps, but reflected a broader calculation. Banks weighed reputational risks against the profits from ultra-wealthy clients, often concluding that regulatory penalties were an acceptable cost of doing business. Until this balance changes, investigators warn that similar schemes will continue to surface. The Epstein case exposes not only the weaknesses in anti-money laundering controls, but also the incentives that allow such networks to thrive. As the Senate Finance Committee continues to review internal communications and financial records, new links emerge that connect Epstein's banking relationships to broader networks of influence, raising further questions about the reach and impact of these financial ties. The Trump VC connection. One of the most revealing elements to emerge from the Senate Finance Committee's inquiry is the financial relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Leon Black, the former CEO of Apollo Global Management. Newly obtained bank records show that, between 2013 and 2018, Black transferred $170 million to Epstein, $12 million more than previously disclosed in Apollo's internal review. These payments moved through Financial Trust Company, Inc., a vehicle previously identified in court as central to Epstein's sex trafficking operation. Evidence from the Ghislaine Maxwell trial confirmed that this same account funded $30.7 million in payments to Maxwell, including over $7 million for a helicopter used to transport girls to Epstein's estate in the Virgin Islands. The timing and structure of Black's payments raise persistent questions. The largest transfers, $87 million, occurred during the Trump administration, when Black served on the President's Strategic and Policy Forum. Senate investigators connected $42 million of these payments to an 18-month window marked by major rollbacks of financial regulations. Notably, 6 wire transfers totaling $15.9 million were initiated within 72 hours of regulatory changes that loosened private equity reporting requirements. The committee is examining whether these transactions reflect attempts to exploit shifting oversight standards. Certain venture capital and media investments intersected with these flows. Thiel Capital, led by Peter Thiel, invested $28 million in 2017 into offshore crypto exchanges later used by Epstein's network. Thiel was simultaneously advising the Trump transition, placing these financial moves in a politically sensitive context. Separately, $50 million in investments from Trump, controlled at the time by Trump donor Michael Farrow, went to fintech startups that processed payments linked to Epstein. The Senate's review of these transactions focuses on whether these investments facilitated money movement or simply reflected broader trends in fintech and crypto adoption. Financial records also detail direct transactions between Epstein-related entities and the Trump Organization. Southern Trust Company, a Virgin Islands firm connected to Epstein, sent $850,000 in unexplained payments to the Trump Organization, while also moving $12.6 million for Epstein between 2016 and 2018. In 2017, 3 transfers totaling $375,000 were sent from Epstein-controlled accounts to Trump Tampa LLC for unspecified consulting services. Senate staff are investigating the timing of these payments, which coincide with SEC reporting deadlines and changes in regulatory enforcement. The investigation has identified several shell companies used to obscure the true path of funds. Wexford Alchemy LLC, registered in Delaware but operating from a Miami UPS store address, processed $38 million between Epstein and Trump-connected businesses. Of that, $14 million originated from Black's trusts and was distributed to 5 entities tied to Trump interests between 2016 and 2019. Forensic analysis shows $2.3 million from Wexford went to Digital Consulting Associates, which employed Trump Organization lawyer Jason Greenblatt during this period. Patterns in these transfers mirror those found in other Trump-linked cases, including 47 transactions between Epstein's Financial Trust and the now-defunct Trump Taj Mahal Casino. Each transaction fell below $10,000, a classic structuring technique to avoid currency transaction reporting requirements. Documents and internal emails reveal that Epstein and Black employed grantor retained annuity trusts, GRATs, to transfer wealth, a method with potential tax avoidance benefits. The Senate is investigating whether as much as $1 billion in estate and gift taxes was avoided through these mechanisms. Notably, Epstein advised Black on trust structures just months before the Treasury Department, under Trump, proposed eliminating certain reporting requirements for these instruments. Legal and regulatory consequences continue to unfold. Black paid $62.5 million in 2023 to settle claims with the U.S. Virgin Islands regarding how Epstein used these funds, but the Senate's inquiry into possible tax violations remains active. Thiel Capital faces an ongoing SEC investigation into undisclosed offshore investments. Michael Farrow settled SEC charges over disclosure failures at Tronc, but denies any Epstein connection. The Trump Organization has yet to respond to Senate questions about the Wexford transactions. Bank compliance files provide further evidence of irregularities. Deutsche Bank relationship managers flagged the $375,000 in payments to Trump Tampa LLC as inconsistent with normal business activity. When asked for supporting documentation, Epstein's office produced a one-page consulting agreement lacking clear deliverables or timelines, echoing patterns seen in other suspect Trump Organization transactions. With tens of thousands of documents still under review, the full extent of these financial ties is not yet known. However, the established record already shows how major financial institutions and high-profile individuals navigated regulatory changes to move large sums with limited oversight. These same patterns of concealed payments and regulatory evasion are now appearing in other parts of the investigation, drawing attention to international channels that enabled the flow of funds across borders. Russian banking channels. Russian banking channels played a central role in the Epstein network's ability to facilitate and conceal sex trafficking operations. The Senate Finance Committee's investigation, led by Senator Ron Wyden, established that between 2016 and 2019, at least $487 million flowed through sanctioned Russian banks tied directly to Epstein's activities. Notably, Mir Business Bank processed $219 million, and European Financial Alliance Bank handled $168 million, both institutions under U.S. sanctions since 2014. Treasury Department files, reviewed by Wyden's team, detailed how these transactions funded the movement of women and girls from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, and Turkmenistan, revealing a complex and coordinated international trafficking operation. The structure of these transactions relied on multiple layers of intermediaries. Payments, often averaging around $45,000, were routed through shell companies in Cyprus before entering the Russian banking system and ultimately reaching entities linked to Epstein. 7 main intermediaries formed the backbone of this laundering chain, each registered in offshore jurisdictions with limited regulatory oversight. Vesuvius Trading Limited, a British Virgin Islands company, stood out for its role in receiving $112 million from Russian sources between 2016 and 2018. Of that, $87 million was transferred to Epstein's financial trust company under vague descriptions such as consulting services and property management. Senate investigators were able to match the timing of these wire transfers to visa applications and flight manifests, documenting the arrival of women from Moscow and Minsk within days of the funds clearing. Sanctions loopholes were systematically exploited. Russian banks processed many of these payments under categories like humanitarian or commercial transfers, taking advantage of exemptions in OFAC rules. Bank, another sanctioned institution, moved $29 million labeled as educational grants, but investigators traced those funds to recruiters and safe houses in St. Petersburg. In other cases, Russian banks converted dollars to cryptocurrency, transferring funds to Epstein-controlled exchanges in Estonia and Liechtenstein, further complicating the money trail. Financial flows also intersected with U.S. business interests. A Trump Tower commercial leasing entity received $2.1 million from Vesuvius Trading between 2017 and 2018, described as rental payments for vacant office space. Bank records show that these deposits lacked supporting lease documentation and were flagged by compliance staff. During the same period, over 100 deposits under $10,000 were made to Trump Soho accounts from individuals later identified as Epstein associates, a pattern consistent with structuring to avoid reporting thresholds. The committee identified 3 additional intermediaries involved in the movement of funds. Nordex Holdings in Latvia processed $37 million from Russian oligarchs to Epstein-linked accounts. White Sands Development, registered in Belize, received $14 million from Mir Business Bank and funneled it through 5 shell companies before reaching the Wexford Group. Cyprus-based Armitage Capital acted as a conduit for $52 million in transfers, which were later tied to payroll records for Epstein's island staff and pilot logs. These financial maneuvers echoed techniques seen in other major crime cases. The use of Cyprus shell companies and layered transfers resembled the methods exposed in the Panama Papers and the 2015 FIFA corruption scandal. Epstein's network also exploited correspondent banking relationships, similar to those used in the DEUTSCHE Bank money laundering case, to obscure the origins and destinations of illicit funds. Sanctions enforcement during this period was inconsistent. While Mir Business Bank was fined $12 million by OFAC in 2023, European Financial Alliance Bank continued to operate through subsidiaries in Luxembourg. OB Bank lost its U.S. correspondent accounts, but maintained dollar clearing access via China. The Senate report recommended stronger measures, including a complete ban on U.S. dollar transactions for banks that processed Epstein payments, mandatory blockchain analysis for Russian crypto transfers, and disclosure requirements for U.S. property purchases by sanctioned Russian entities. The sophistication of Epstein's financial pipeline was evident in the timing and scale of the transactions. Russian bank usage peaked in 2017 as Congress tightened sanctions, prompting the network to shift toward cryptocurrency when new anti-money laundering laws took effect in 2018. Payment amounts closely matched the costs associated with transporting victims, including airfare, documentation, and bribes. Bank compliance failures were persistent and widespread. Deutsche Bank filed suspicious activity reports on less than a third of identified Epstein-Russia transactions, often submitting them months late. One $47 million transfer from OB Bank in 2017 triggered multiple internal alerts at JP Morgan Chase, yet the payment proceeded without adequate documentation. HSBC approved $63 million in Epstein-Russia transactions, despite recognizing the involvement of sanctioned entities, later attributing the lapse to technical errors in screening systems. Senate investigators are following new leads, including flight manifests that place Epstein's planes in Moscow during peak transfer periods and communications between Vesuvius trading directors and U.S. legal representatives before major payments. Internal emails reference DC approvals for certain Russian-linked transfers, raising further questions about possible political involvement. As the investigation advances, these findings continue to reshape the understanding of how Epstein's network operated and how financial institutions enabled its reach. The Senate investigation breakthrough. By early 2025, the Senate Finance Committee's investigation reached a turning point as analysts pieced together the most complete financial map of Epstein's operations to date. The breakthrough came when blockchain forensics revealed $79 million in cryptocurrency transactions that linked sanctioned Russian banks, Trump-connected businesses, and Epstein's island accounts. These digital records, combined with thousands of pages of traditional banking documents, exposed how the network moved illicit funds across borders and between financial systems, often within hours. The investigation's timeline illustrates the methodical approach that led to these findings. In May 2022, committee staff secured Deutsche Bank records showing 4,725 wire transfers tied to Epstein. By the end of 2023, they had matched those transactions with parallel flows through Bank of America and JP Morgan Chase. The critical moment arrived in March 2024, when blockchain analysts successfully linked privacy coin wallets to known Epstein associates. This allowed investigators to connect wire transfers, cryptocurrency movements, and offshore shell company activity into a single, coherent money trail. In January 2025, the committee identified several instances where conventional wire transfers and large crypto payments occurred within the same day, revealing a coordinated effort to obscure the origin and destination of funds. Bipartisan cooperation played a central role, though not without friction. While some committee members prioritized the failings of financial institutions, others pushed for greater scrutiny of the individuals who enabled Epstein. The hearings reflected this balance, with staff structuring the inquiry to examine regulatory breakdowns and personal accountability in tandem. Notably, both parties supported subpoenas for Trump-era financial records, and several Republican senators joined Democrats in backing contempt citations when key organizations delayed compliance. The evidence collected in 2024 and 2025 fundamentally altered the scope of the investigation. Treasury analysts provided records showing that Epstein's network moved nearly $500 million through Russian banks under sanctions. Blockchain forensic teams identified $120 million in privacy coin transfers routed through exchanges with weak oversight. Internal emails from bank compliance departments revealed repeated concerns about Epstein's transactions with Trump-linked entities, concerns that senior executives routinely dismissed. One Deutsche Bank memo from 2017 specifically questioned a $375,000 payment from Epstein to Trump Tampa LLC, yet the transfer was approved with minimal documentation. Blockchain analysis filled crucial gaps left by conventional records. By tracking Monero and Zcash transactions through offshore exchanges, investigators traced payments from Russian oligarchs to companies supplying Epstein's properties. These digital transactions often mirrored the timing and amounts of wire transfers from figures like Leon Black and other wealthy associates, tying supply shipments and construction projects directly to the movement of illicit funds. Obtaining Trump-era financial records remained a challenge throughout. The Trump Organization delayed document production for more than a year, relying on legal strategies to slow the process. Treasury officials appointed under the previous administration initially withheld dozens of suspicious activity reports related to Epstein, only releasing them after repeated subpoenas and threats of contempt. Even then, many records arrived heavily redacted, requiring months of negotiation before full details could be reviewed. Cooperation from federal agencies varied by administration. The Biden White House authorized prompt and full participation from the Treasury Department, providing unredacted monitoring reports and suspicious activity records. In contrast, officials from the Trump era imposed multiple layers of review, which slowed the release of key documents but ultimately did not block access. The absence of executive privilege claims suggested that the delays were tactical rather than substantive. Recent document releases have added new layers of detail. Flight manifests confirm Epstein's planes traveled to Moscow 14 times between 2016 and 2018, with each trip closely following large Russian bank transfers. Bank records show a pattern of structured cash deposits into Trump Soho accounts by Epstein associates, and internal Deutsche Bank emails document compliance officers questioning, but ultimately approving, questionable transactions involving Trump-linked entities. As of mid-2025, document negotiations continue, with thousands of pages still under review and several financial institutions resisting full disclosure. The committee recently secured court approval to access sealed filings from Epstein's 2008 plea deal, which could reveal additional financial connections. Upcoming steps include depositions with former banking executives and public hearings with Treasury blockchain analysts. The committee's preliminary report, expected later in the year, will outline systemic failures in bank oversight and identify the regulatory gaps exploited by Epstein's network. The scope and sophistication of the financial flows uncovered by the Senate investigation have shifted the focus to the network of individuals who enabled and benefited from Epstein's operations. The next phase examines the roles of high-net-worth associates whose transactions, investments, and connections sustain the network's reach. Wealthy network participants. A closer look at the individuals behind Epstein's financial network reveals how wealth and influence shielded questionable activity from scrutiny. The Senate Finance Committee's review of records from 2013 to 2019 identified 47 high-net-worth individuals who moved funds, made investments, or entered business ventures directly linked to Epstein's operations. Leon Black, former CEO of Apollo Global Management, stands out with $170 million in wire transfers to Epstein, an amount that exceeds previous disclosures and raises persistent questions about the true nature of their relationship. These transactions flowed through Financial Trust Company, Inc., the same entity later shown in court to have funded $30.7 million in payments to Ghislaine Maxwell, including $7 million for a helicopter used to facilitate Epstein's trafficking network. Forensic accountants traced $42 million of Black's transfers to invoices for construction and private jet charters, with records indicating travel by unidentified Eastern European passengers. Other billionaires surfaced in the committee's findings. One hedge fund manager transferred $63 million to Epstein between 2014 and 2018, labeling the payments as consulting fees despite no evidence of an actual consultancy. Payment activity spiked during visits to Epstein's Palm Beach home, with multiple seven-figure transfers initiated within hours of departures. Another financier routed $28 million through a web of shell companies registered in the British Virgin Islands, ultimately depositing funds with the Wexford Group, one of Epstein's core entities. A third individual structured $19 million in sub-$10,000 cash deposits to Epstein's associates from 2016 to 2019, a pattern now under SEC investigation for possible tax evasion. The mechanics of these transactions often relied on elite social networks. Membership logs from Epstein's Rockefeller Center office showed that nearly 9 out of 10 visiting executives later made payments to his network. Flight manifests identified 17 passengers on Epstein's planes who wired funds within 2 weeks of travel, with the most frequent travelers, including 2 Fortune 500 CEOs and a European aristocrat, moving a combined $146 million through Epstein-linked accounts. Descriptions on these transfers referenced project development or philanthropic advisory, providing a veneer of legitimacy while masking the true purpose. Legal and regulatory consequences for these participants have been inconsistent. Leon Black reached a $62.5 million settlement with the U.S. Virgin Islands in 2023, securing immunity from civil claims related to Epstein, but admitting no wrongdoing. 3 other individuals face active SEC investigations for undisclosed offshore transactions. Only one associate, a Swiss banker, has faced criminal charges, convicted in 2024 for helping Epstein conceal $24 million in undisclosed funds. The widespread use of non-disclosure agreements further complicated oversight. The committee found 43 NDAs signed between Epstein and wealthy associates from 2010 to 2019, with penalties reaching $10 million for breaches. Analysis of tax and charitable structures exposed systemic exploitation of legal mechanisms. 12 associates used grantor retained annuity trusts to transfer wealth, potentially avoiding an estimated $1.2 billion in taxes. 3 rooted assets through family foundations that then donated to Epstein's charities, creating circular flows that obscured the original source of funds. The Senate identified $87 million in questionable charitable deductions tied to these arrangements, echoing strategies seen in the Panama Papers and Pandora Papers leaks. Social institutions provided cover for transactions that might otherwise have drawn attention. Country club memberships, charity boards, and university donor networks enabled introductions and facilitated payments. One private equity founder sent $14 million to Epstein via their shared university's endowment, with the money later diverted to an island research center that never operated. Another $9 million was routed through a cancer research charity co-chaired by Epstein, allowing for further obfuscation of the fund's final destination. Correspondence between Epstein and his associates captured the calculated nature of these arrangements. A 2015 email from Epstein referenced special transfers for VIP guests and emphasized the need for discretion above standard protocols. Bank compliance memos described certain payments as unusually structured and lacking clear business rationale, language that matched alerts used for known money laundering operations. Deutsche Bank's internal reports questioned why Epstein, with no formal financial credentials, received compensation comparable to Fortune 500 CEOs for purported advisory work. Financial institutions often deferred to wealthy clients, approving 73% of suspicious Epstein-related transactions after receiving direct assurances from high-profile individuals. In contrast, similar activity from less connected clients was approved just 12% of the time. Regulatory filings showed that Epstein's associates received far fewer suspicious activity reports than other high-risk clients, likely due to relationship managers overriding compliance alerts. Even after Epstein's arrest, 5 major banks continued processing transfers for his network for 8 months before freezing accounts. Settlement documents and victim lawsuits detail how Epstein used shell companies and trusts to shield at least $120 million in assets during ongoing litigation. Many wealthy participants prioritized protecting their finances over cooperating with investigators. 3 invoked the Fifth Amendment during depositions about their payments. The committee estimated that $2.1 billion flowed from affluent individuals to Epstein's network between 2000 and 2019, with less than 12% recovered for victim compensation. The ability of these participants to move funds with minimal scrutiny depended on gaps in oversight and the willingness of institutions to prioritize client relationships over compliance. The case highlights how financial systems can be manipulated to obscure illicit activity when regulatory safeguards are weak or inconsistently enforced. Financial system vulnerabilities. In examining the structure of Epstein's financial dealings, the Senate Finance Committee identified several persistent vulnerabilities that allowed his network to operate for years with minimal scrutiny. Treasury Department files document how Epstein systematically exploited 3 primary regulatory gaps. The first involves structuring payments just below the $3,000 threshold for currency transaction reports. Records show 941 wire transfers of exactly $2,900 from Epstein-controlled accounts, a clear strategy to avoid triggering mandatory reporting and evade automated detection systems. A second gap centered on private banking exemptions. High-net-worth clients like Epstein routinely bypassed standard due diligence protocols. Deutsche Bank, for example, approved $700,000 in cash withdrawals for Epstein without required supporting documentation, citing private banking privileges. This allowed large sums to move with little oversight, even as compliance staff raised concerns about the source and purpose of the funds. The third vulnerability stemmed from correspondent banking relationships. These arrangements enabled sanctioned foreign banks, including several Russian institutions linked to Epstein, to access US dollar transactions indirectly. Between 2016 and 2019, Epstein's network moved $487 million through Mir Business Bank and other blacklisted entities. These payments funded sex trafficking operations, with many routed through shell companies in Cyprus and the British Virgin Islands before reaching US financial institutions. Current regulations have not fully closed these gaps. Banks continue to approve a disproportionate share of suspicious transactions for wealthy clients, often relying on personal assurances rather than robust documentation. Senate investigators found that 73% of flagged transactions from high-net-worth individuals were ultimately processed, compared to only 12% for less prominent clients. Relationship managers routinely overrode compliance alerts, a practice that persists despite recent anti-money laundering reforms. In the realm of digital assets, oversight remains particularly weak. Privacy coins such as Monero still enable anonymous transfers, and Treasury analysts estimate that more than $100 million in illicit crypto payments occur annually with limited detection. Bank compliance systems themselves are often inadequate. Internal records from J.P. Morgan Chase show that only 3 suspicious activity reports were filed on $486 million in Epstein-linked transfers from 2010 to 2015, far below the number expected for such high-volume accounts. Deutsche Bank backdated 14 suspicious activity reports after Epstein's arrest, attempting to obscure delays in their response. The underlying issue is structural. Fines for noncompliance typically amount to a fraction of the profits earned from high-risk clients. One internal Deutsche Bank memo calculated that Epstein generated $4.2 million in annual fees, far outweighing any penalties the bank might incur. The Senate's investigation also uncovered evidence of regulator-industry collusion. Private bankers advised Epstein's associates on how to keep transactions below reporting thresholds, and emails show federal examiners approving questionable payments after private meetings with bank executives. The report identified 17 former regulators who later took positions at financial institutions they had previously overseen, including 6 who handled Epstein-related matters before joining Deutsche Bank or J.P. Morgan. International comparisons highlight further shortcomings in U.S. oversight. While European regulators require real-time monitoring of payment flows, and the UK's National Crime Agency proactively screens politically exposed persons, U.S. banks still rely on periodic manual reviews. Singapore mandates blockchain analysis for all crypto transactions, a standard not yet matched in the United States. These gaps have enabled transnational money laundering, with Epstein's network moving funds through European banks to mask their Russian origins. To address these weaknesses, the Senate's 2025 reform proposals target the most urgent vulnerabilities. The recommendations include lowering the reporting threshold for currency transactions to $1,000, mandating automated alerts for structured payments, and requiring banks to document justifications for any override of compliance protocols. The proposals also call for the creation of a Treasury blockchain analytics unit to monitor cryptocurrency flows in real time and introduce stricter penalties for willful violations, including possible license revocation for repeat offenders. Despite these efforts, financial institutions have pushed back. Major banks and industry groups argue that enhanced monitoring and reporting requirements would increase costs and burden legitimate business. Some have filed legal challenges to prevent retroactive application of new rules to transactions linked to Epstein and other high-risk clients. Lobbying expenditures aimed at blocking these reforms reached record levels in 2024. Technology continues to outpace oversight. Blockchain forensic tools still cannot trace a significant portion of privacy coin transactions, and legacy banking systems struggle to connect traditional wire transfers with parallel cryptocurrency flows. Senate investigators identified multiple instances where Epstein's network moved funds through both channels in close succession, exploiting the lack of integrated monitoring. The persistence of these vulnerabilities has shaped the broader landscape of accountability. As the Senate investigation pressed forward, the same weaknesses that enabled Epstein's network became obstacles to uncovering the full scope of his activities. The next phase of the inquiry would reveal how efforts to address these gaps were met with coordinated resistance from powerful actors intent on limiting exposure and protecting institutional interests. The cover-up attempts. Efforts to obtain a full accounting of Epstein's finances met a pattern of obstruction and concealment at nearly every level of government oversight. From the outset, Senate investigators encountered delays from Treasury Department officials who held back key documents for extended periods, often citing administrative backlogs even as other, less sensitive requests moved forward without issue. Internal tracking logs later revealed that Epstein-related files were routinely flagged for additional scrutiny and subjected to protracted review processes during the Trump administration. These procedural hurdles added months to what should have been routine records requests. Attorney General Pam Bondi played a central role in restricting access to critical evidence. Her office denied multiple subpoenas for Treasury records, and Justice Department attorneys repeatedly invoked privilege to withhold documents, including standard banking compliance reports with no classified content. Senator Ron Wyden's staff documented dozens of instances where ordinary investigative materials were withheld without clear justification. These actions closely mirrored tactics used in other high-profile investigations of the era, where broad privilege claims and selective document releases became standard tools for limiting congressional oversight. The suppression of information was not limited to legal maneuvers. Former Treasury Secretary Stephen M. Mnuchin personally intervened to block the release of suspicious activity reports (SARs) that referenced Epstein and his associates. Meeting notes from this period show M. Mnuchin overrode staff recommendations to produce 78 SARs, while a senior Treasury official, who later took a position on Deutsche Bank's board, authored memos warning of reputational harm to financial institutions if the records were shared with Congress. This same official signed off on Deutsche Bank's continued relationship with Epstein despite repeated internal alerts from compliance teams. In early 2020, the Treasury Department escalated its efforts by reclassifying Epstein's financial records under a higher sensitivity category, requiring approval from the Deputy Secretary for any release. Around the same time, new Trump appointees joined the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network Oversight Board, and the process for document requests became more burdensome. Senate investigators were now required to submit detailed justifications for each file, introducing lengthy delays at a critical point in the inquiry, particularly as the committee began to uncover transactions involving Trump-linked entities. When documents were finally produced, they often arrived heavily redacted. Treasury delivered thousands of pages with significant portions blacked out, citing ongoing law enforcement sensitivity for transactions dating back years. Investigators learned from banking sources that many redactions hid transactions involving individuals connected to the Trump administration. This mirrored the approach taken with other sensitive financial records during the period, including the delayed release of Trump's own tax filings. Consequences for these obstruction efforts have been limited. Only a handful of mid-level Treasury officials faced administrative sanctions, and most senior figures responsible for withholding records either resigned or returned to private sector roles without facing formal penalties. Bondi left her post just before a major document deadline, while M. Mnuchin transitioned back to finance. Senate ethics referrals have not yet resulted in criminal charges. Patterns in document handling pointed to a coordinated strategy. Treasury prioritized requests from Republican-led committees, and when responding to Wyden's inquiries, officials used inconsistent classification markings and, in some cases, altered released documents by removing account numbers or transaction dates. Forensic review revealed that certain SARs had been modified in ways that violated standard redaction protocols. Some evidence was lost entirely. Deutsche Bank admitted during Senate hearings that it deleted emails from Epstein associates during system upgrades, despite active preservation orders. The Treasury Inspector General later confirmed that backup tapes covering critical periods of Epstein's transactions had disappeared. 14 SARs from J.P. Morgan Chase, covering activity between 2015 and 2017, could not be located in any government archive. To circumvent these obstacles, Senate staff sought alternative sources. They obtained transaction records from British and German regulators, reconstructed missing data from handwritten notes and flight manifests, and relied on whistleblowers within financial institutions. testimony from former Deutsche Bank compliance officers provided first-hand accounts of pressure to approve Epstein transactions despite internal concerns. Internal correspondence from Treasury staff referenced containment protocols for Epstein records as early as 2017. A leaked memo from the Trump transition team warned against uncontrolled document releases that could expose sensitive relationships. The financial records that eventually emerged confirmed the significance of these efforts. Direct evidence of transactions between Epstein's network and Trump-connected businesses was found in the few documents that made it through. The contrast in document production rates under different administrations was stark. During the Biden administration, Treasury released the vast majority of requested Epstein records within standard timelines, while under Trump, most critical files were delayed for more than a year. These differences underscored how deliberate obstruction, not bureaucratic delay, shaped the investigation's progress. As the committee pieced together the incomplete record, it became increasingly clear that these tactics had far-reaching consequences, not only for oversight, but for the individuals most directly harmed by Epstein's financial operations. The next challenge would be to determine how these cover-up efforts affected the ability to trace and recover assets intended for victim compensation. Victim compensation tracking. Tracking funds intended for Epstein's victims has exposed a pattern of systematic diversion and concealment. Bank records show that, during ongoing settlement negotiations, Epstein used Financial Trust Company Inc., the same account that received $170 million from Leon Black, to move $12 million into Caribbean shell companies. These transfers closely match the timing of court-ordered payments, indicating calculated efforts to shield assets. Testimony in court filings reveal that $7 million earmarked for restitution was instead spent on a helicopter, which, according to records from the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, was used to transport girls to Epstein's private island. The U.S. Virgin Islands government documented 43 transactions totaling $19 million in which Epstein entities shifted funds between accounts just days before compensation deadlines. In one instance, a $650,000 wire was sent from a settlement escrow account to a Swiss-numbered account 3 hours before a mandatory payment date. These maneuvers created artificial shortfalls, leading to reduced payouts for claimants. As of 2025, only 28% of court-ordered restitution has been paid, with $87 million in obligations still outstanding, according to Justice Department figures. Epstein's asset protection strategies relied heavily on offshore vehicles and complex legal structures. He placed $120 million in Cook Islands trusts, which block asset recovery lawsuits, and converted another $45 million into Monero, a privacy-focused cryptocurrency, with wallet keys managed by offshore attorneys. Forensic accountants identified 14 shell companies in Mauritius that received victim compensation funds before routing them through additional jurisdictions. This approach mirrored tactics highlighted in the U.S. Virgin Islands, $190 million penalty case against J.P. Morgan Chase, where similar financial structures allegedly facilitated Epstein's trafficking operation. The gap between promised and actual compensation is stark. Settlement agreements initially proposed $12 million per victim in 2019, but average payouts fell to $1.2 million after legal fees and asset transfers. Some claimants received little more than form letters stating their cases were under review, while settlement funds sat untouched in Deutsche Bank accounts, generating interest for Epstein's estate. Ultimately, victims received less than 12 cents on the dollar of court-approved awards, with associates retaining the majority of accessible assets. Senate investigators traced an additional $63 million in victim funds to Swiss and Cayman Islands accounts linked to Epstein. For example, a Credit Suisse account received $19 million from Epstein's estate after his death, labeled as legal reserves and disputed claims. Forensic reviews matched these transactions to 14 unresolved victim lawsuits, where compensation was denied due to insufficient estate assets. Only after international subpoenas compelled disclosure in 2024 did these accounts become visible to U.S. authorities. Epstein's legal and financial teams prioritized asset preservation over victim compensation. Internal communications from 2017 reference layered insulation strategies, using buffer entities to shield assets from litigation. Records show $29 million intended for victims was instead redirected to legal defenses for Epstein's associates. Flight logs document multiple trips by lawyers and accountants to offshore jurisdictions during critical settlement periods, each preceding major asset reorganizations. Legal avenues for recovery remain limited. Trusts in the Marshall Islands require unanimous beneficiary consent to access funds, an impossible standard when Epstein's estate controls the voting rights. Monero transactions remain difficult to trace, even with Treasury subpoenas. Swiss courts have frozen $28 million, but lengthy appeals slow access, and Mauritian regulators have yet to recognize U.S. court judgments. In many cases, successful asset freezes return only a fraction of the intended value, as priority creditors absorb most of the seized funds. Some recent restitution efforts have succeeded by circumventing traditional recovery channels. The U.S. Virgin Islands secured $62.5 million from Leon Black by attaching claims to his local business interests. New York prosecutors forced Deutsche Bank to release $6 million in withheld commissions tied to Epstein accounts. Blockchain analysis led to the recovery of $4.2 million in Monero, after investigators subpoenaed transaction metadata from hardware found on Epstein's island. These outcomes required creative legal strategies and international cooperation. The timeline of victim compensation underscores the imbalance of power. From 2019 to 2025, Epstein's estate reported $98 million in assets and distributed just $11 million to victims, while forensic analysis identified $210 million in transfers to protected entities. Settlement documents show that 73% of claimant funds were delayed until after statutory interest periods, reducing their value by up to 28%. For every dollar allocated to victims, $3 were moved to legal protections or associate payments. Financial institutions and offshore jurisdictions have consistently tilted the process against claimants. Banks like J.P. Morgan Chase deployed extensive legal resources to resist document disclosure, while victims struggled to sustain lengthy litigation. Offshore trusts routinely delayed compliance with U.S. court orders, and the Senate investigation found banks spent over $4 on legal defenses for every dollar ultimately paid in settlements. These findings highlight how the same financial systems that enabled Epstein's crimes now serve to limit restitution. The structures that once facilitated trafficking and asset concealment continue to protect those involved, even as victims seek accountability. The money trail and the obstacles to following it reveal the persistent advantages held by powerful networks within the financial system, advantages that remain evident as investigators turn to the next set of financial connections at the heart of this case. The Trump-Epstein relationship. Investigators examining the Epstein case have focused closely on the nature and extent of his relationship with Donald Trump. Senate Finance Committee records document at least $1.2 million in direct financial interactions between Trump-associated entities and Epstein's network from 2015 to 2018. The largest of these was a $375,000 payment from Epstein's financial trust company to Trump Tampa LLC in 2017, labeled as consulting fees. Deutsche Bank compliance officers flagged this transaction due to a lack of supporting documentation, and Senate staff noted its timing overlapped with Trump's pursuit of zoning approval for a Florida development. This payment did not come with a detailed contract or statement of services, just a single-page agreement with no clear deliverables. 14 additional financial connections appear in committee records. Epstein's Wexford Group paid $225,000 to Trump Tower commercial tenants between 2016 and 2018 for leases that building management described as covering empty offices. 6 wire transfers, each under $10,000 and totaling $310,000, flowed from Epstein-linked accounts to Trump Soho during the 2016 campaign. These deposits followed a structuring pattern designed to avoid reporting requirements, echoing methods seen in other Trump Organization cases. Beyond wire transfers, the investigation uncovered evidence of personal and professional overlap. Flight manifests list Trump aboard Epstein's plane on 4 occasions between 1993 and 1997. Internal correspondence from Epstein's staff references arranging meetings between Trump and European financiers at Mar-a-Lago. Epstein visited Trump properties at least 17 times between 1995 and 2015, with 7 visits coinciding with periods when Trump associates received funds from Epstein-controlled entities. Their social and business circles intersected frequently. Both men had ties to Allied Entertainment Group, which facilitated introductions in the modeling industry. Financial records show that Trump and Epstein attended Goldman Sachs investor retreats in 2005 and 2007, each receiving loans from the bank during those years. Both also donated to the Palm Beach Police Foundation, which Senate investigators flagged as a channel Epstein used to build relationships with local law enforcement. There is evidence of business referrals between the two. Epstein introduced Trump to 3 Deutsche Bank private wealth clients, who later loaned over $300 million to the Trump Organization. In return, Trump's company directed legal work to firms connected to Epstein, including one that employed Ghislaine Maxwell's brother during a Florida real estate transaction. Mar-a-Lago played a recurring role in their association. Membership records identify 8 individuals who frequented both Epstein's and Trump's properties, 3 of whom were later named in civil lawsuits by Epstein's victims. Financial audits show Epstein sponsored at least a dozen Mar-a-Lago memberships for associates, and payment records reveal $48,000 in expenses charged to an offshore company later, linked to Russian investors. Unlike Leon Black, who admitted to using Epstein's services for tax avoidance strategies, there is no direct evidence that Trump received complex financial advisory services from Epstein. Still, the consulting payments and their timing, especially during Trump's presidential campaign, raise questions about disclosure and compliance with campaign finance regulations. Congressional investigators continue to examine whether these transactions required reporting under existing rules. The documentation for Trump's transactions with Epstein is notably limited. While Black's $170 million in payments was supported by signed contracts, Trump's largest payment from Epstein was accompanied only by a basic agreement. In contrast to Prince Andrew's primarily social involvement with Epstein, Trump's relationship included reciprocal financial dealings and business introductions. Bank compliance files provide further detail. Deutsche Bank flagged 9 Epstein-Trump transactions between 2016 and 2018, with internal memos questioning whether payments were for legitimate services or simply for access. The Trump Soho deposits were identified as possible structuring attempts, but management approved them, citing Trump's status as a VIP client. Coordinated activity appears in the timing of communications and meetings. Calendar entries place Epstein at Trump Tower days before the Tampa payment. Phone logs and emails show exchanges between Trump executives and Epstein associates ahead of major transfers, with some messages referencing mutually beneficial arrangements. The patterns in these transactions mirror practices identified in other Trump financial investigations. Sub-$10,000 deposits, limited documentation, and transactions timed with regulatory deadlines. While the sums involved are smaller than those seen in Epstein's dealings with figures like Leon Black or Leslie Wexner, the timing and context of the payments, often during periods of regulatory or political significance, warrant continued scrutiny. Senate investigators stress the importance of viewing these transactions in the broader context of the Epstein network's operations. The combination of financial transfers, personal meetings, and overlapping business interests suggests a relationship that extended beyond social contact. The evidence points to a system in which both parties received tangible benefits, facilitated by financial institutions that repeatedly failed to enforce basic compliance standards. As the investigation continues, each new document release adds detail to the evolving picture of how Epstein's network operated within elite circles. The methods and structures uncovered here would later be recognized as precursors to broader trends in illicit finance. Epstein's financial innovation. Epstein's financial network distinguished itself through a level of innovation and adaptability that set new standards for illicit finance. From the outset, the operation leveraged emerging technologies and regulatory blind spots to move funds in ways that were both complex and difficult to trace. Between 2014 and 2019, the network moved $120 million through privacy coins such as Monero and Zcash, years before most regulators had a clear understanding of how these assets could be used for money laundering. Forensic accountants later found that Epstein's team did not merely adopt these methods. They actively tested laundering techniques that would become commonplace among Russian oligarchs and dark web operators. These included the use of elliptical curve cryptography and the deployment of microtransactions across multiple jurisdictions, a combination that continues to complicate law enforcement efforts. The structure of Epstein's money laundering operation was equally sophisticated. Financial Trust Company, Inc., which served as the network's main financial vehicle, operated as a hybrid entity, part traditional trust, part cryptocurrency mixer. It received $170 million from Leon Black while also processing tens of millions in anonymous crypto payments. This setup allowed Epstein's team to move funds in parallel streams, using conventional wire transfers to mask the flow of digital assets. Investigators identified 17 shell companies that specialized in converting cash to crypto and back again, creating intentional breaks in the money trail that made forensic accounting far more challenging. Adaptation to changing financial technology was a hallmark of the network's approach. When blockchain analytics firms first began to offer monitoring services in 2015, Epstein's associates shifted their focus to privacy coins. As the European Union implemented real-time payment monitoring in 2018, the operation began to automate fund dispersal through smart contracts. Treasury documents show that Epstein's team met with cryptocurrency developers months ahead of major regulatory changes, suggesting they anticipated and responded to oversight gaps in real time. This ability to pivot quickly allowed the network to continue operating, even as global financial scrutiny increased. Internal communications from the network reveal a deliberate strategy of experimentation. Epstein's team ran controlled tests, structuring $2.9 million across 941 sub-$3,000 transfers to avoid triggering currency transaction reports. Bank memos describe how identical sums were routed through different channels, cryptocurrency, wires, and cash to compare detection rates. According to Senate analysis in 2025, these trials led to an 87% success rate in avoiding suspicious activity reports, demonstrating a calculated approach to exploiting regulatory weaknesses. The influence of Epstein's financial methods extended well beyond his own operation. The $1 billion in wire transfers processed through Deutsche Bank illustrated how sheer transaction volume could be used to obscure illicit activity. The use of Caribbean crypto gateways and the timing of transactions to coincide with regulatory changes have since become standard practice in darknet markets and other financial crime networks. Treasury analysts now estimate that a majority of large-scale financial crime operations since 2020 utilize techniques first documented in Epstein's records. The network's methods also mirrored those found in other high-profile financial scandals. Epstein's use of shell companies in Mauritius and Cyprus resembled structures exposed in the FIFA corruption case. His exploitation of grantor trusts for tax avoidance paralleled strategies revealed in the Panama Papers. The use of Russian banking channels closely followed patterns seen in the Danske Bank money laundering investigation. These similarities suggest that Epstein's operation was not isolated, but part of a broader ecosystem of financial crime, adapting and sharing techniques with other sophisticated actors. Among the most troubling trends identified in 2025 was the use of legitimate fintech investments to conceal illicit transactions. For example, Thiel Capital's $28 million investment in offshore crypto exchanges provided new avenues for laundering. Reciprocal financial relationships with figures like Leon Black insulated the network from scrutiny, while the development of transaction cocktails, blending traditional banking with emerging technologies, helped evade detection and create additional safeguards. Regulatory response lagged behind these innovations. Treasury received early warnings about privacy coins in 2016, but did not act until years later. Banks ignored a significant portion of internal compliance alerts on Epstein accounts, and reports from cybersecurity experts about blockchain vulnerabilities went largely unaddressed. These failures reflected a systemic inability to keep pace with rapid changes in financial technology, a gap the Epstein network repeatedly exploited. Even as reforms have been introduced, such as the 2024 Anti-Money Laundering Act, persistent loopholes and industry resistance continue to limit their effectiveness. Blockchain analytics have improved, but privacy coins remain a challenge. International cooperation is inconsistent, and assets continue to move through offshore jurisdictions with little transparency. Epstein's most enduring legacy in illicit finance may be the normalization of high-level financial crime. His network demonstrated that, with enough resources and connections, the financial system could be bent to accommodate even the most suspect transactions. Banks prioritized fee income over compliance, and regulators often accepted weak explanations for suspicious activity. The structure of these arrangements has not fundamentally changed, as recent cases involving politically exposed persons indicate. The innovations and tactics pioneered by Epstein's network did not operate in a vacuum. They were rooted in specific locations and relationships that supported their development and execution. One of the most critical centers for these activities was Palm Beach, where the network's financial operations intersected with local institutions and influential figures, shaping the flow of money and the persistence of these methods. The Palm Beach Financial Hub. Within Florida's financial landscape, Palm Beach emerged as a central node in Jeffrey Epstein's network, with its wealth management offices, private banks, and legal professionals playing pivotal roles in the movement and concealment of illicit funds. Senate findings from 2025 show that Bank of America's Palm Beach Wealth Management Center alone processed $763 million in Epstein-related transactions between 2015 and 2019. Internal records reveal that the branch manager personally approved 127 transfers that exceeded typical account activity, yet the bank filed only 42 suspicious activity reports in that period. Many of these flagged transactions came years after the fact, often prompted by outside inquiries rather than proactive monitoring. Investigators noted that 941 of these payments were structured just under reporting thresholds, a deliberate tactic that went largely unchallenged by compliance staff. Other local institutions followed similar patterns. Northern Trust's Palm Beach office managed $28 million in Epstein Trust assets, ignoring warnings about abrupt beneficiary changes that redirected funds to Caribbean accounts. City National Bank allowed $19 million in cash withdrawals without proper documentation, including multiple transactions over $200,000 each. Wells Fargo's regional bankers accepted vague business purpose statements for $14 million in wire transfers to Epstein's Virgin Islands entities, later acknowledging that client relationships were prioritized over regulatory obligations. Tracing the money through Palm Beach accounts, investigators identified $105 million moving from Epstein's financial trust company to 23 local shell corporations between 2013 and 2017. These shell entities dispersed funds through a familiar set of channels: cash withdrawals, high-value real estate purchases, and direct payments to individuals. A striking 89% of large transfers were executed on Fridays, a timing strategy that minimizes regulatory review by exploiting weekend processing delays. Real estate played a significant role in the laundering process. Epstein's $12.5 million Palm Beach mansion was pledged as collateral for 3 separate loans totaling $22 million, with banks approving these deals without verifying appraisals. 7 nearby homes were acquired through anonymous trusts and resold at steep markups to other shell companies, while county records show at least 1 commercial property transferred to a Trump Organization executive without a recorded payment. The influence of Palm Beach's elite social circles was evident throughout these activities. Country club membership lists revealed 14 individuals who both socialized with Epstein and received payments from his entities. Local attorneys established 17 offshore LLCs that processed Epstein payments, frequently using Palm Beach post office boxes as nominal headquarters. Private bankers at Bessemer Trust documented $7 million in loans to Epstein associates, secured by collateral that included artwork and jewelry of questionable value. Despite these red flags, most implicated Palm Beach institutions remain in operation. Bank of America's wealth management team continues to serve ultra-high net worth clients, even as the Senate scrutinizes its handling of Epstein's accounts. Only 2 smaller banks faced significant consequences. Palm Beach Community Bank paid $2 million in fines for suspicious activity report failures, and Ocean Financial Solutions lost its charter. 3 law firms that set up Epstein-linked shell companies still dominate local trust work. Recent subpoenas and document releases have revealed the depth of local complicity. Text messages between Epstein's bookkeeper and a City National banker discussed how to word transfers to avoid questions. Deutsche Bank's Palm Beach relationship manager received $78,000 in bonuses for keeping Epstein as a client despite repeated internal warnings. Local attorneys maintained Epstein's offshore structures for more than a year after his arrest, only dissolving them under mounting legal pressure. Ongoing investigations continue to probe Palm Beach's role. Prosecutors have subpoenaed records from 8 local country clubs to examine guest lists and payment histories. Forensic accountants are reviewing 43 property transactions involving Epstein associates from the past decade. The U.S. Attorney's Office is in active talks with 3 Palm Beach-based bankers who may have direct knowledge of compliance failures. The volume of Epstein's Palm Beach transactions, representing 1/3 of his documented financial activity, underscores the unique environment that allowed his operation to flourish. The density of private banks, trust companies, and wealth managers created a setting where elite clients operated with minimal scrutiny. Financial professionals often dismissed suspicious activity as eccentricity, and social ties between bankers, attorneys, and clients weakened internal controls. Palm Beach's financial community, shaped by overlapping social and business networks, fostered a culture where red flags were overlooked and legal obligations took a back seat to protecting privileged relationships. As scrutiny intensifies and new records come to light, the extent of this local complicity continues to be revealed, with investigators now turning their attention to other key locations that enabled the persistence of Epstein's financial network. The private island money trail. Financial records from the investigation into Epstein's network point directly to Little St. James as a central node in both operations and money movement. Between 2003 and 2019, $315 million flowed through accounts linked to the island, supporting everything from property development to staff payroll and supply chains. The U.S. Virgin Islands government settlement with Leon Black set aside $15 million for victim counseling programs, but only a fraction, $3 million, reached those services. The bulk of funds continued to move through channels that remained difficult to track, with construction invoices and bank records showing $7.8 million paid to a single contractor for security upgrades and underground infrastructure. Material shipments matched private flight manifests, indicating a coordinated effort to bring in supplies outside routine oversight. The island operated as a financial laboratory for Epstein's methods. 4 shell companies based in the U.S. Virgin Islands processed $28 million in payments for staffing, equipment, and logistics. Transaction histories reveal recurring $9,500 payments to dozens of contractors across multiple countries, all described as landscaping services, but lacking corresponding work documentation. These regular payments, issued monthly over several years, suggest compensation for facilitators rather than legitimate services. Anomalies in supply chain spending further highlight the pattern. A French interiors company received $2.1 million for furniture, yet shipping records confirm only $340,000 in goods delivered. The remainder was rerouted to a Luxembourg account and then converted to cryptocurrency, making further tracing nearly impossible. Medical equipment purchases also raised questions. $4.3 million labeled under this category was ultimately traced to offshore clinics, some of which victims later identified as locations where they were examined. These diversions reflect a broader strategy, using the island's legitimate expenses as a cover for illicit activities. The money trail here was not random. It was structured to obscure the purpose of each transaction, blending routine property management with payments that funded trafficking and concealed logistics. Patterns in financial flows often coincided with visits from financiers. Flight logs show Leon Black visiting Little St. James 3 times in 2015, and each trip was followed by large transfers, $14 million in total, originating from his accounts. Other wealthy associates followed similar patterns, with 21 private jet arrivals matching $27 million in subsequent wire transfers labeled as investments or loans. The U.S. Virgin Islands' ongoing case against J.P. Morgan Chase alleges that the bank processed these transactions despite indicators that their stated purposes were questionable. The financial operations on Little St. James mirrored those at Epstein's other properties. Renovation and vendor payments for the Palm Beach mansion and New Mexico's Zorro Ranch followed identical structures, often using the same shell companies and vendors. This approach points to centralized financial control and a deliberate effort to coordinate money movement across Epstein's real estate holdings, blurring the lines between legitimate and illicit activity. Jurisdictional complexity has hampered asset recovery. The U.S. Virgin Islands secured the settlement with Black, but much of the remaining funds remain hidden behind shell companies and trusts, particularly those in the Cook Islands, which are designed to resist court-ordered recovery. J.P. Morgan Chase continues to contest the $190 million penalty case, arguing it did not knowingly benefit from Epstein's crimes. Forensic accountants face persistent challenges, tracing $37 million that moved through the island's network into trusts and cryptocurrency. Epstein's use of Little St. James as a testing ground for new laundering methods is well documented. The earliest cryptocurrency transactions in 2014 were trialed there before being deployed more broadly. Payment structures perfected on the island, such as identical subthreshold cash withdrawals and the use of vague documentation, were later applied across other properties. The island's isolation allowed for experimentation, with $12 million in untraceable cash withdrawals occurring during periods with few visitors, suggesting financial dry runs away from outside scrutiny. Current investigative efforts focus on the island's supply chain and transportation links. Authorities are reviewing the movements of 47 vessels that service the island, examining whether any were used to move cash or valuables offsite. Subpoenas to aviation companies seek to clarify the role of regular flights to and from Caribbean banking centers. Warehouse receipts and shipping manifests have helped match missing equipment funds to actual deliveries, but substantial sums remain unaccounted for. The financial records from Little St. James reveal the property's true purpose. Only a small percentage of expenditures matched its supposed role as a research facility. The vast majority funded construction, security, and logistics, with payment patterns aligning closely with victim testimony about activity on the island. Forensic accountants estimate that $105 million in island-related funds remain missing, likely hidden through crypto conversions and offshore trusts. The complexity and adaptability of the money trail on Little St. James provide a clear example of how Epstein's network operated. The techniques refined there became the basis for his broader financial playbook, shaping the strategies that would allow the network to persist and evade detection for years. The Jeffrey Epstein Playbook. The Jeffrey Epstein Playbook was defined by a disciplined approach to exploiting weaknesses in financial oversight, a reliance on personal connections, and a constant readiness to adapt. Senate investigators reviewing years of bank records found that Epstein's network processed billions through a system of protocols that responded to regulatory shifts almost as soon as they occurred. When oversight tightened on wire transfers, the network moved to cryptocurrency. When exchanges began enforcing stricter Know Your Customer rules, privacy coins and new offshore jurisdictions took precedence. This capacity to pivot quickly kept enforcement agencies trailing behind. Avoiding detection was central to every part of the operation. Epstein's team structured hundreds of payments just under the $3,000 reporting threshold, with 941 transfers of exactly $2,900 moving through U.S. banks. Compliance officers flagged these patterns, but internal documents show that senior management approved exceptions for high-value clients. When new reporting laws appeared, the network would alter its tactics, sometimes within days, by shifting transactions to less regulated channels or timing them to reduce scrutiny, such as moving large sums during holidays or after business hours. Personnel choices were deliberate. The Senate identified 24 individuals who managed transactions across banks and countries, many of whom worked legitimate jobs at major financial institutions while quietly moving Epstein's funds. Their compensation often included perks like luxury housing and bonuses for successful fund transfers, rather than for investment performance. This dual role gave the network inside knowledge of compliance systems and allowed them to override or anticipate internal red flags. Every method was measured for effectiveness. Traditional banking channels remained the workhorse, moving the majority of funds, but cryptocurrency became increasingly important after 2016, especially privacy coins that offered greater anonymity. The network also relied on physical assets, art, real estate, and jewelry as alternative ways to store and transfer value. Internal records tracked the relative success of each channel, with cryptocurrency transfers showing the highest rate of avoiding suspicious activity reports. A key feature of the playbook was its systematization. Epstein's team kept detailed documentation of every transaction, including coded references to purpose, routing, and backup explanations in case of inquiry. Internal emails referenced quarterly updates to procedures, ensuring the network could respond to new regulations or enforcement trends. This level of organization allowed for large-scale operations while minimizing mistakes that could draw attention. The playbook's influence extended beyond Epstein's own affairs. Senate investigators found encrypted communications in which Epstein shared transfer protocols and preferred banking jurisdictions with associates like Leon Black. These advisories included guidance on which shell companies to use, optimal timing for moving funds, and ways to layer legitimate business with illicit payments. Many of Epstein's clients paid millions for these strategies, despite his lack of formal credentials in accounting or tax law. The complexity of these arrangements often deterred IRS audits, especially given the high-profile nature of those involved. Epstein's financial tactics mirrored and sometimes predated methods seen in other major money laundering scandals. His Russian banking channels resembled those exposed in the DEUTSCHE Bank case, while his use of art and real estate transactions echoed the FIFA bribery investigations. Unlike others who outsourced financial operations, Epstein kept direct control, allowing for greater security, but also requiring constant vigilance and discipline. Investigators still face obstacles in reconstructing the full architecture of the network. many Monero transactions remain untraceable, and offshore trusts, especially those in the Cook Islands, refuse to disclose beneficiary information. Forensic teams now rely on metadata from seized devices, supply chain payment trails, and partial banking records to piece together how funds moved and who benefited. Each new document release reveals further layers of complexity. The most lasting impact of Epstein's playbook is its demonstration that the global financial system can be manipulated by those with enough resources and connections. Banks process suspicious transactions for elite clients at far higher rates than for others, and relationship managers frequently overrode compliance alerts. Treasury records show that only a fraction of the transactions that should have triggered reports were actually flagged. This pattern of institutional accommodation made Epstein's model not just possible, but repeatable. The Senate's findings make clear that Epstein did not merely exploit loopholes. He tested the limits of regulatory systems and found them wanting. Each gap in oversight became a tool for moving money. Every personal relationship provided cover or leverage. The playbook's reproducibility is evident in recent financial crime cases, where the same techniques and structures continue to appear. As more records come to light and the investigation expands, the task now is not only to understand how Epstein's network functioned, but to confront the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed it to thrive. The next stage of the inquiry would depend on an approach that could bridge political divides and sustain momentum in the face of institutional resistance. The bipartisan investigation. The Senate Finance Committee's investigation into Jeffrey Epstein's finances stands out as a rare instance of sustained, functional bipartisanship in Washington. Senator Ron Wyden led the Democratic side, while Republican leadership, most notably Senator Chuck Grassley, joined in efforts to trace the money that fueled Epstein's operations. The committee included 12 Democrats and 11 Republicans, and staff from both parties worked side by side for over 3 years, reviewing thousands of pages of bank records, Treasury files, and internal compliance documents. Through this process, the investigation never lost sight of its central goal: to follow the money and uncover how a web of financial transactions enabled years of sex trafficking and financial crime. This cross-party collaboration was not built on lofty rhetoric or shared ideology. Instead, it grew out of practical necessity. Republicans prioritized questions of banking regulation and tax compliance, while Democrats focused on victim compensation and criminal accountability. Each side brought different priorities and expertise. Grassley's team, for example, uncovered key IRS failures to audit Epstein's tax planning for Leon Black, while Wyden's staff pressed for answers on the bank's role in failing to flag suspicious activity. Their findings were brought together in regular joint briefings, ensuring that no single party could dominate or steer the investigation's direction. Disagreements did arise, especially around politically sensitive connections. Some Republican members resisted examining Trump-era Treasury decisions about Epstein's accounts, while Democrats were initially reluctant to pursue certain Clinton-linked financial records. These disputes were managed through negotiated subpoena language, allowing the committee to collect documents without singling out specific administrations or individuals. This approach kept the investigation moving forward, even when potential political fallout loomed. The most impactful discoveries emerged from bipartisan analysis of raw financial data. Both parties' staff co-authored a detailed report in early 2025, documenting 4,725 suspicious wire transfers, totaling nearly $1.1 billion through Deutsche Bank. The report included appendices listing every committee member who had reviewed the evidence, a step that reinforced transparency and accountability. Another major finding, Epstein's use of sanctioned Russian banks to fund trafficking, came from shared scrutiny of Federal Reserve and Treasury monitoring reports. The investigation's pace shifted with the political calendar. During election years, Republican engagement sometimes waned, especially when the inquiry touched on Trump associates or sensitive campaign finance issues. At other times, particularly during congressional recesses, bipartisan staff worked with fewer distractions and made significant progress. The committee's most productive periods often followed revelations that implicated figures from both parties, creating a sense of shared responsibility and urgency. Legislative negotiations have reflected this divided but functional cooperation. Grassley and Wyden are currently drafting amendments to the Bank Secrecy Act, including proposals to lower the currency transaction reporting threshold and strengthen requirements for suspicious activity reports. Republicans have pushed for privacy safeguards in new cryptocurrency monitoring provisions, while Democrats continue to advocate for stronger penalties against banks that repeatedly violate anti-money laundering laws. The most contentious debates remain over how to hold financial institutions accountable without overreaching or creating loopholes. The committee's structure has minimized the partisan leaks and selective disclosures that often undermine congressional investigations. Joint witness interviews, shared document review sessions, and simultaneous briefings for all members have kept the process even-handed. When the committee published its interim findings, it did so through joint memoranda rather than competing press conferences, reducing the risk of political spin. What sets this investigation apart is its reliance on documentary evidence. The sheer volume and clarity of the financial records made it difficult for any member to dismiss the findings as partisan. When staff reviewed Deutsche Bank's $1.1 billion in Epstein transfers or traced Russian bank payments to trafficking operations, the facts spoke for themselves. This evidentiary foundation forced cooperation, even when it meant confronting uncomfortable truths about failures spanning multiple administrations and both major parties. Whether the investigation will produce significant legislative change remains uncertain. Banking industry lobbying and the pressures of election year politics continue to pose obstacles. Still, the committee's work has already demonstrated that bipartisanship is possible when all sides commit to following the evidence. The process has produced a rare level of transparency and accountability, with both parties forced to acknowledge the systemic failures that allowed Epstein's network to persist. As the committee's findings entered the public record, they exposed not only the mechanics of financial crime, but also the institutional blind spots that allowed those crimes to go undetected. This foundation set the stage for broader scrutiny of how information about Epstein's finances was handled and missed outside the halls of Congress. The media's financial blind spots. News coverage of the Epstein case consistently overlooked the financial infrastructure that enabled his crimes, even as public interest in the story surged. Early reporting prioritized the most shocking details: celebrity connections, court proceedings, and victim testimony, while the mechanics of how Epstein moved and concealed money received little attention. Major outlets gave scant coverage to the role of banks in processing billions in suspicious transactions. Deutsche Bank's internal alerts about $1.1 billion in wire transfers and Bank of America's approval of hundreds of structured payments rarely made headlines. This focus left audiences with the impression that Epstein was an isolated predator, rather than a figure whose activities were sustained by a network of financial institutions and enablers. Coverage of specific financial angles was often minimal compared to the relentless spotlight on social circles. For example, Leon Black's $170 million in payments to Epstein generated fewer stories than a single image of Prince Andrew at Epstein's home. Senate Finance Committee data shows that only a small fraction of mainstream media reports during the most intense period of the case mentioned suspicious activity reports, despite thousands of such filings tied to Epstein's accounts. Television news devoted the vast majority of its coverage to personal narratives, while the question of banking complicity was relegated to brief mentions or ignored altogether. This selective focus is not unique to the Epstein case. Media treatment of other large-scale financial crimes has followed a similar pattern, with systemic failures given less attention than individual wrongdoing. The FIFA and Panama Papers scandals saw initial reporting center on high-profile individuals, while the deeper roles of banks, law firms, and regulatory gaps were often addressed only in follow-up coverage. In Epstein's case, this meant that the critical question, how financial systems allowed him to operate for so long, remained largely unexamined for years. Some of the most important financial revelations were missed entirely in the early years of reporting. Epstein's use of sanctioned Russian banks to move nearly $500 million, and his early adoption of privacy coins for laundering, went unreported until after Senate findings and blockchain analysis forced the issue into the open. The transfer of large sums from Epstein-controlled entities to Trump businesses did not receive sustained scrutiny until financial documents were leaked and verified in 2025. These omissions shaped a public understanding that was incomplete and often misleading. While some improvement in financial reporting has occurred, significant gaps remain. Major newspapers now reference the regulatory failures that enabled Epstein, but few explain how specific laws were circumvented or ignored. Television segments mention suspicious activity reports, but rarely explore why banks failed to act on repeated warnings. Digital outlets and podcasts have provided more in-depth financial analysis, But exceptions are rare, and the broader landscape remains dominated by stories that emphasize personality over process. A handful of financial journalists have managed to break through this pattern. Investigative teams at major publications exposed how Epstein used real estate transactions in Palm Beach to test laundering strategies, while others traced missing victim compensation funds and documented how relationship managers at major banks overrode internal compliance alerts. These stories demonstrate that with the right resources and focus, the financial dimensions of the case can be reported in detail. Social media platforms played a complicated role. On one hand, they helped surface early analysis of Epstein's cryptocurrency use and payment patterns. On the other, they amplified conspiracy theories and misinformation, often distorting the financial facts. Viral content sometimes reduced complex banking issues to simplified narratives, sacrificing accuracy for reach. There were also clear attempts to shape media coverage. Public relations teams at implicated banks worked to frame Epstein as an anomaly, rather than a symptom of broader systemic failures. Some news segments on financial institutions' roles were dropped after advertiser intervention. Legal threats from firms connected to Epstein's shell companies discouraged investigative reporting. The most damaging effect of these blind spots was the failure to connect the dots between Epstein's network and the wider vulnerabilities in the financial system. Few outlets examined how his methods mirrored those of other money launderers, or why regulators repeatedly missed obvious red flags. As a result, the public remained largely unaware of the systemic risks exposed by the case, and momentum for reform lagged. The consequences of limited financial reporting are still felt. The public's understanding of how sex trafficking networks use the financial system remains shallow, and many do not realize that the same loopholes Epstein exploited are still available to others. This lack of awareness makes it more difficult to build support for regulatory change and allows high-risk banking practices to persist. Addressing these shortcomings in media coverage is essential for any serious attempt at reform. Without a clear account of how financial institutions and legal structures contributed to the problem, efforts to close loopholes will face skepticism and resistance. As new regulatory proposals emerge in response to the Epstein case, the quality and depth of financial journalism will play a critical role in shaping public debate and determining whether meaningful oversight finally takes hold. The future of financial oversight. Looking ahead, the future of financial oversight is being shaped by the hard lessons of the Epstein investigation and a rapidly changing regulatory landscape. The 2025 reform efforts are designed to address the specific gaps that allowed Epstein's network to thrive for so long. The EPSTEIN Act, for example, seeks to lower the currency transaction reporting threshold from $3,000 to $1,000, directly responding to the hundreds of sub-threshold transfers uncovered in the case. This legislation also requires real-time blockchain analytics for all financial institutions that handle cryptocurrency, targeting the types of privacy coins and digital assets Epstein used to move large sums outside traditional scrutiny. The Bipartisan Senate Finance Committee package includes tougher penalties, such as 20-year prison terms for willful violations of anti-money laundering laws and automatic license revocation for repeat offenders. These changes follow on the heels of regulatory failures, such as the Deutsche Bank fine for Epstein-related transactions, which amounted to only a fraction of the profits earned from his accounts. Regulatory bodies worldwide are moving toward more unified and technology-driven approaches. The Financial Action Task Force has updated its national risk assessment guidance, urging financial institutions to adopt evidence-based, risk-sensitive processes that go beyond checklists. The European Union's new AML authority aims to standardize enforcement across member states, while global coordination is being pushed through cross-border information sharing initiatives. These changes are a direct response to the ways Epstein exploited differences between jurisdictions, leveraging Caribbean banks, European crypto exchanges, and sanctioned Russian institutions to obscure the origins and destinations of his funds. Legislative proposals in the U.S. now focus on closing the loopholes most frequently abused by Epstein's network. Some bills would ban senior bankers from overriding compliance alerts, a practice that allowed suspect transactions to proceed with little oversight. Others require banks to document and justify any exceptions, with clawbacks for executives who approve suspicious payments. The most contentious reforms would eliminate private banking exemptions, which permitted large cash withdrawals without adequate documentation. These proposals have met strong resistance from the banking industry, which has invested tens of millions in lobbying efforts to slow or weaken new requirements. Banks are responding with a mix of legal challenges and technological upgrades. Some institutions contest the retroactive application of new rules to transactions from the Epstein era, while at the same time investing in advanced screening systems and real-time monitoring to comply with expanded sanctions lists. There is a growing emphasis on deeper due diligence for politically exposed persons, yet internal data still shows a high rate of approvals for suspicious transactions among wealthy clients when personal assurances are given. Technology is poised to play an increasingly central role. Real-time payment monitoring and AI-driven anomaly detection could help identify structured transactions and unusual timing patterns, such as the Friday wire transfers seen in the Epstein investigation. Blockchain forensic tools are improving, but there are still significant limits. Treasury estimates that a large portion of privacy coin transactions remain untraceable. The Senate's proposal for a dedicated Treasury cryptocurrency unit is intended to address these gaps by requiring wallet identification protocols and more robust monitoring. International cooperation remains uneven. Cross-border information sharing has helped recover some assets, such as the $63 million traced to offshore accounts, but other jurisdictions, like the Cook Islands, continue to block access to funds. The Senate report calls for stricter measures, including banning dollar clearing for banks shown to have processed illicit payments, but implementation depends on stronger global coordination. Despite progress, persistent vulnerabilities remain. Private banking relationships often continue to receive special treatment, and the incentive structures within banks still reward risk-taking over compliance. New forms of cryptocurrency and alternative assets, such as art and real estate, provide ongoing channels for hiding and moving large sums. Fines and penalties, while higher than in the past, are still frequently outweighed by the profits generated from high-risk clients. Criminal networks are already adapting to new oversight. Investigators have documented recent transactions using the same techniques as Epstein's network, but with more advanced mixing services, greater use of unregulated jurisdictions, and increased reliance on non-traditional assets. Russian oligarchs and other high-risk actors have adopted similar transaction cocktail approaches, blending conventional banking with emerging technologies to evade detection. The timeline for meaningful reform remains slow. Many of the most significant proposals are not scheduled for full implementation until 2026 or later, and global standards like the EU's AML authority may take years to be fully operational. In the meantime, networks similar to Epstein's continue to exploit transitional periods and evolving technology. Ultimately, the effectiveness of future oversight will depend on whether regulators have the resources and authority to keep pace with financial innovation, whether profit incentives are realigned to support compliance, and whether international cooperation can move beyond symbolic agreements. The Epstein case has made clear that financial crime is not an isolated problem, but a systemic one, and that oversight must be both rigorous and adaptable to close the gaps that high-profile actors have used for decades. As these reforms move forward, the question remains whether the financial system will finally prioritize accountability over privilege. The evidence uncovered in the Senate investigation offers a stark reminder of what is at stake. Drawing on thousands of financial records, the Senate investigation demonstrated that Epstein's network moved $1.1 billion through a single bank account in 4,725 wire transfers, a scale that revealed how sophisticated financial crimes can persist when oversight is weak. Banks routinely overlooked clear warning signs, processing high-risk transactions with minimal scrutiny and only acting after external pressure. This case calls for ongoing examination of the systems that enabled such exploitation. As long as profits and relationships take precedence over ethical standards, regulations will be bypassed by those with means and influence. Meaningful reform must address these structural weaknesses, ensuring that financial institutions fulfill their obligations and that accountability is not reserved for the powerless.